Political theory, a brief on the role of mass movements.
A mass movement in this context is simply the capacity to literally move masses of people. There may be worth in the symbolism thereof, as in, where to where and why are people so moving, but the main point is just literally the ability to move masses of people. There is a kind of political understanding involved on that front which is important to spell out and acknowledge for what it is. It is a mock capacity of the gathering of troops for war. The point here isn't to say that such is a literal prelude to war though. The point is that the politically wise can see that kind of movement and respond to it as if it were exactly a prelude to war. Folks can think of it in terms of an almost purely symbolic means of killing war by way of abstracted movements of people, providing that folks in political power recognize it as such. Failure to recognize it as such risks that symbology being transmuted to the literal movements of war. As in, if the peaceful means when shown to be great in the classic political arena of note, the mobilization of masses of people for war, are not taken to be the show of strength that they are, there is a serious risk of defaulting on that agreement towards peaceful resolutions of political conflicts. There are other kinds of calculations involved with the mass movements of people, especially within a democracy, such as public spotlight, movement of public opinion, recognition of a voting bloc, alteration of cultural norms, and even capacity of direct action. And those are important in terms of how to handle the realities of the symbolic movements that gather for war. Specifically, those sort of things are ways and means of measure as to how to address the underpinning motivational factors, and in a more important sense as a means to supply victory for such movements without having to actually resort to the mechanisms of literal war. This is markedly different than an understanding of democracy and the ballot box themselves as being stand-ins for war, as in means of conflict resolution. They are, in some sense, but I'd say far more as means of conflict resolution than as stand-ins for war. Mass movements, the capacity to gather people together, to move them towards particular aims, is far and away more the point of stand-ins for war than democratic processes as such. There are also limitations to this as a means of resolution, specifically as concerns the realities of morality and the limitations of democracies to give. If the aims of a mass movement are immoral, there is an incumbency upon the government to resist them, to exactly not acknowledge them, not give in to them. Such of course risks war all the same, but such is the incumbency of morality. There are also limitations whereby if the mass movement is against democracy itself, then they also ought be opposed no matter how large, so as to avoid the destruction of the very means whereby such kinds of movements are allowed and enabled to be, and to be effective. Simple resolution of the paradox as to if a democratic process ought be allowed to end democratic practices, more or less at any rate. Here it is a bit more, ought a mass movement be allowed to end the capacity for all mass movements, but such is embedded within the democratic systemization. We might also hold that these are related, in that democratic processes are the moral thing to have, and hence the ending of them is also a movement towards immoral ends and aims.
Some points of guidance on the method and means of mass movements.
Among the key points to understand is that the mass movement itself is far more important than the specifics of it. Far too oft folks are caught up in the specifics, the symbolisms involved, the theatrics of it, the means and mode of sending the proper message, when the reality is much more about the capacity to make a mass movement at all. I don't want to suggest that there is nothing at all to that stuff, and there are some interesting and worthwhile subtleties to explore, such as direct action movements, but especially as regards the symbolism involved, these take a back seat. Technically, the message does actually matter, as one needs to be able to control what message is being sent lest it be co-opted by hostile forces. But in this generalized sense of discussion, the message as such doesn't matter, so much as the control of the message so it doesn't get distorted. Similarly, the message and the messenger matters in the sense of usefulness towards the gathering of people for a mass movement. Charisma makes that possible. But again, the importance of the mass movement is the mass movement itself, not the message or the messenger per se. Those kinds of concerns are concerns about the individuals involved, and the specific politics, beliefs, ideologies, philosophies, etc., that folks may want to create a mass movement around. Online movements do not have the same effect. This is because the power of a mass movement lay exactly in the capacity to get folks to literally, not virtually or figuratively, move themselves. As a stand-in for the march to war, for the gathering of troops towards some political aims, it simply has to occur IRL. Now, folks can of course use the internet to marshal the forces, to send the message, to spread the word, to organize the gatherings and so forth. But simply doing mass internet action of most any sort isn't going to cut it. Again, I'd point to the interesting aspects of direct actions, maybe especially in terms of online movements, for their unique capacity via open source workings to actually make stuff happen. There are a couple of rather specific points of order regarding the message of a mass movement that are relevant. Firstly, letting the folks in power understand that y'all understand the importance of mass movements as a stand-in for the gatherings towards war is pretty critical. Now, it needn't be so doom and gloomily put, but they do need to understand that y'all understand the seriousness of a mass movement. Secondly, having real actualizable aims that are being communicated is actually important, and far more so than the generalized complaints or concerns. Being concerned about police brutality is a fine and noble thing, but leaving it up to those you are trying to convince as to what to do about it is folly. Getting them to move on the issue writ large, but leaving it up to them to decide how that exactly plays out only lets them determine the means of resolution to the concern, which of course may not be sufficient. If this isn't clear, take the Swifties. They can move people, but are they moving towards anything at all? Do they understand that movement as being a stand-in for the seriousness of war? What could anyone do to appease them? Nothing. As they stand for nothing. They have no real complaints. The only IRL movements they make are towards concerts. There is nothing to be scared of regarding Swifties, as they have nothing to frighten anyone with. Well, unless you are like them and hold too dearly to the mirrorness of the image, the message and the messenger, in which case simply being opposed by them can be to your ruination. But such as me, and such as the notion of a mass movement in general, the opposition of something as vacuous as the Swifties would actually be a boon. For they thereby draw forth the contrast to the realities the mass movements are about. Not to pick on the Swifties, nor to try and avoid their ire, I just find them to be a good relatable mass movement in the current that illustrates the point by way of example of what a mass movement ought not be. Be bold. Mass movements are stand-ins for wars. They are not to be done over trivial things, and their resolutions ought not be trivially minded. A mass movement isn't asking, it is demanding, it is threatening, it is forcing those with political power to do the things it wants. Don't ask for a lollipop, folks. Similarly, be careful, thoughtful, about what y'all are demanding. As noted, there is incumbency upon the political powers that be to ignore the unethical, and to ignore that which promises to topple democracy, even if it means going to actual war over it. Be careful, thoughtful, be ethical in what y'all demand, but note that impossible, and especially politically impossible, is not in the vocab for such demands. Mass movements are what make the heretofore impossible possible.